All right. Well, good morning and good afternoon, everyone, depending on what coast you're on. My name is Carrie Scott. I work at Spruce Health, and we are joined today by Yunetta Spring Smith. So excited to have you, Yunetta. This is going to be an exciting session. In case y'all need a reminder of why we are gathering today, we are going to be talking about getting unstuck. And Yunetta is going to walk us through moving past early trauma to bring your whole self to your work and to your patients. And I think this is a really critical topic to cover because, well, for starters, we've never talked about this on a Spruce webinar before. And I think that this is something that folks work with, whether you're in this line of business or, even in my job, sometimes it's hard to get unstuck and bring my whole self to work. So I'm excited to see what Yunetta has in store for us. Couple of housekeeping items. This session is being recorded. So if for some reason you have to drop off early or you have something you want to revisit later on, this will be sent to you as a link later on today, and you can go back to the content and watch it again at your leisure. If you have any questions, please drop them into the Q&A down at the bottom. We disabled chat because it can just get a little too hard to keep up with, but Q&A is the perfect place to drop your questions in. And because Yunetta has so much good content to cover, we're going to hold your questions until the end, but we're going to try to get to as many of them as we can. So do drop them in as you think of them so that we have them locked and loaded for the end of our session. We're probably going to run about 45 minutes of content, and we'll leave 15 for Q&A. With that, I'm not going to take up any more of our precious time because Yunetta has so much good stuff to talk to today. And I'm just going to pass the baton and drop back and let her shine here. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you, Carrie. I appreciate you having me on. Super excited to talk to everyone about something I love, which is helping individuals heal from trauma and get unstuck in business and life. So this presentation, Getting Unstuck, Moving Past Early Trauma, because we want to be able to bring our whole self to our work and with our patients and show up fully and authentically. So as we navigate this presentation, just a little bit about me, some background on me. I'm Yunetta Spring Smith. I'm a private practice owner, therapist, licensed professional counselor, mental health service provider, and I'm based out of Tennessee. Springforth Counseling is my practice. I've been there for about 8 years. I also have Groundbreakers Coaching and Consulting, where I help people navigate how to integrate EMDR into their practice. I'm an EMDR trainer and consultant, and I have a workbook surrounding self-care. We'll talk about that a little bit later. And a fun thing I get to do is pop in on the Ricky Smiley Morning Show. It's a nationally syndicated radio show, and my segment is Talk It Out Tuesday, and we talk a lot about breaking the stigma surrounding mental health and helping people, encouraging people to go to therapy. And I'm an international speaker, so I work with a great group of clinicians, and they host international speaking events, and I get to, hop on some of those and coach and support clinicians. So lots that I do, love what I do, and I'm super excited and grateful to be here with y'all today. So as we get into getting unstuck, I want to kind of go over some objectives. So these are some of the things that we're going to talk about as we navigate this presentation. We went all the way to the end, y'all. Let's start over. So y'all get a preview of all of my slides because it jumped ahead. What we're going to talk about first as we get going is recognizing that the change that you want to see, it starts and begins in you. The change that you want to see, it begins with you. The change that you want to see, it begins through you. And the change that you want to see is waiting on you. So we were in a group together, I would say that, like I would have you repeat that the change I want to see begins in me. The change I want to see begins with me. The change I want to see begins through me. And the change I want to see is waiting on me. So kind of keeping that in the forefront of your mind as we go through these various parts of this presentation. So some of our objectives today are going to be, let's see, So some of our objectives are, we're going to look at getting a clear understanding of what constitutes trauma, and its effect professionally and personally, some symptoms and manifestations of being stuck. So we're going to be able to do this just through a self-assessment. And when I say a self-assessment, I mean that if you notice that throughout this presentation, something I say hits you a certain way, or something I say you feel like, oh, something came up, something got activated in me, then that's your indicator to lean in. And I always say, try to lean in with curiosity versus leaning in with defensiveness, and just get curious about why this is coming up for me, or what this could potentially be connected to. And then we're going to talk about some practical ways to integrate self-care, talk about how personal healing helps us professionally, and then look at some ways that we can build compassion as we navigate being resilient, because we know you're already resilient. But sometimes we can be really critical of ourselves, and we want to show up and be more compassionate. All right. So if you have a pen and piece of paper, I want you to take some things down really quickly and go through this reflection with me, this self-reflection with me. I want you to be able to, I want you to start with your breath, because our breath is our foundation. It's our anchor. It's how we can ground ourselves. It's what we do every day, all the time, and we're not even really paying attention to it. But oftentimes, we're breathing in a way that kind of activates our nervous system a little bit. So if you would, with me, just kind of put one hand, if you can, up, if it's safe to do so, one hand on your chest, one hand on your belly, and just kind of check in and see how you're breathing just naturally and normally. And me checking in, because I'm just starting this presentation, I'm noticing my chest is doing a little bit more of the work. So I want my belly to be doing more of the work. So as I inhale, I'm going to expand my belly and diaphragm. And then as I exhale, I'm going to release the air from my belly and diaphragm. So that's how we want to be breathing throughout the presentation. We want to be breathing from our belly and not our chest. When we breathe from our belly, we are sending signals that I'm safe, that it's okay, that there's plenty of oxygen available for me. When I breathe from my chest, that's sending a signal more so that there is danger present. Maybe I may be a little hyper aroused or activated, and we want to get that breath going, down to our belly. So I want you to grab a piece of pen and paper, and we're just going to breeze through this, but I just want you to jot down some stuff. So I want you to identify 3 people who have impacted your life in some way, shape, or form throughout the course of your life, from childhood up until now. I want you to identify 3 people in no particular order. So I want you to write their names down. And then after you write those 3 people's names down, I want you to think about a core memory that comes up that's related to them. And this can be good, bad, happy, sad, whatever the case may be. I just want you to think of a memory or something that relates to them. So it could be basketball practice. It could be driving to school in the morning, or breakfast, or whatever it is that you feel like associates with those people. I want you to write down those 3 names, and then those 3 events or things that feel connected to those people. And then after you have that, I want you to think of something that is distressing for you now. So something that's like mildly irritating or distressing, nothing major. So it could be like traffic coming into work, forgetting something, rushing to get on this webinar. On a scale of 0 to 10, this will be something that would be like a 5 or below, okay, in terms of distress. And I want you to write that down. So just write down something that's distressing, a little irritating for you right now. And then of that, when you think of those 3 people, and when you think of what's distressing for you, I want you to identify which one of those 3 people would you go to for encouragement, for support, for advice. Which one of those 3 people would you go to just to feel a little bit better about whatever it is that you're dealing with? And then once you kind of highlight, underline that person, I want to ask, what is something that they would or they have said to you? Would they encourage you or criticize you? What would you, after you talk to them, what would you walk away thinking, feeling, or believing about yourself? And I want you to write down what you would think, what you would feel, what you would believe about yourself after having a conversation with them. And if that belief is negative, or if it's not to landing too well, or you will walk away feeling worse than you did before you came, then I want you to identify what is it that you would like to think, feel, or believe about yourself after having that conversation with them. So as we navigate this training, I want you to consider how that relationship you have with that person that's been pivotal throughout your life, whether it be childhood, whether it be presently, how that integrates into the material that we're about to cover. You know, how does it feel connected to the information we're going to get into? So keep that with you. We're going to circle back around to it. And I want to kind of end this reflection just with some breathing. Breathing is a great way to reset. So if something came up for you, or you talked about somebody and you're noticing or feeling anything in your body, any kind of activation or distress, I want you to take a big deep breath in through the belly and exhale through the mouth. And we're doing a little bit of math. Every time we breathe, we're subtracting and we're adding. So we're adding what we need more of, and we're subtracting what no longer serves us or what we want to let go of. So as you think about this exercise, as you think about what you want to hold on to, I want you to breathe that in. And as you think about what you're wanting to release, I want you to exhale. All right. So I hope that was helpful for you. We'll continue on as we navigate through this info. So when we're going to be looking at trauma, and we look at trauma, we need to know that trauma occurs anytime the nervous system experiences something that is too big, too fast, too soon, too hurtful, or for too little, or for too long, all without repair or attunement, right? So trauma can be anything. And we're going to go through what some different types of trauma is, what it looks like, but just understanding that it could be anything. So I want you to think about this in the scope of any event that caused you distress without support. So if you experienced something and there was no repair, there was no comfort, right? There was no one coming in afterwards to say, this is okay. Any upsetting or confusing occurrence that didn't provide the mental, physical, or emotional resolution you needed, right? So you fell and nobody came to wipe your boo-boo off or clean it off or clear it off. You know, it came with some kind of negative reaction. Any situation that required you to react or respond above your developmental age or stage. So if you were that oldest sibling that had to take care of younger children, or if you were exposed to things a little bit sooner than you would expect to be exposed to certain things, and developmentally your brain wasn't able to conceptualize or understand what was going on. It could be anytime you experience prolonged fear without appropriate comfort or support afterwards, or any event that caused you to have to numb or normalize painful and confusing situations, right? So times when you had to check out, numb out, normalize it, make it a joke when it wasn't really funny and it was actually very scary. And then thinking about any event that leaves the nervous system in a semi-permanent state of dysregulation. So we're designed to experience stress in a way that, okay, there's stress, and then I recognize that I'm safe, and then I'm able to stabilize. But when we look at trauma, the stress comes, but the solution or the stabilization doesn't come afterwards. And that's what causes it to get stored in our system in a different way. So when we look at what trauma looks like, there are various types of trauma. So we have acute trauma, we have complex and chronic trauma. I have those grouped together. Then we have secondary trauma and intergenerational trauma. So when we're looking at acute trauma, a lot of people consider this like big T trauma, single incident, something happened. We like to categorize it as events that should not have happened that happen. So this can be a natural disaster, a car accident, mass shooting, terrorist attacks, things of that nature, sexual violence, things like that. It should not have happened, and it happened, and it leaves an imprint in our system. Complex or chronic trauma sometimes can fall into that category as like maybe type 2 or what we consider like a little t trauma. And that could be if it's something that's repetitive and repeated and prolonged. And this can happen across the scope of your entire lifespan. The way I like to look at this is events that should not have happened, events that should have happened that did not happen. So when we're looking at that, we're looking at neglect and abuse and interpersonal violence and civil unrest. So these things there was something that should have happened that did not happen that created this wound and created this trauma. And then when we're looking for healthcare professionals, as we are, we're looking at secondary trauma and how that could be impactful. So this is for first responders, healthcare providers. If you are engaging with people who are experiencing trauma, or you are interfacing with people on a regular basis who are in distress, we can develop vicarious or secondary trauma as a result of that. And then now there's a lot of research coming up around intergenerational trauma. And this is trauma that's passed down from one generation to the next. And this can be experienced by a collective group. This crosses the span of lifetime. So what your grandmother experienced, essentially, when your grandmother was on this earth and what she experienced was passed down to your mother as well as you, because all three of y'all were in the same body at the same time, right? And what your father experienced was passed down to you, to your what your grandfather experienced was passed down to your father, and essentially you experienced those as well. So we're learning a lot more about that through epigenetics and how trauma is passed down generationally. We see traces of this through slavery and genocide and racism. So all of these are ways that trauma can be landing and showing up for you. I want y'all to be thinking about what lights up for you or what feels connected to your experience as we're going through this, because early trauma can be anything from household challenges to neglect, natural disasters. Mario Bouquet has an amazing book called Break the Cycle. And these are some of the examples she shared there. It could be if you were exposed to addiction, your parent was incarcerated. It could be having a bad breakup or being in a toxic relationship, or having an unexpected move, or losing a pet, or disclosing something vulnerable to someone and being betrayed. Trauma can show up in so many different ways. And it's important to not box this in and say it has to be something that's a big T or has to be something catastrophic. Anything that threatens our sense of safety, our life, that causes us to feel like we might not make it to see another day or overwhelms our system, can be categorized as traumatic. So when we're looking at some of the long-term effects of trauma, because trauma affects our body and has so many influences, somatic experiences that we get when we experience trauma, it really can impact our health, right? So we can develop anxiety and depression. We can isolate and want to detach from people or surroundings that feel similar to our traumatic experiences. We can be angry or irritable or hypervigilant. And then when it comes to our relationships, because of the place in our brain that trauma impacts, it can cause us to question and second guess people, cause us to question and second guess ourselves. So we leave with this sense of these trust issues. We can have challenges with communicating because the part of our brain that gets activated when we experience trauma is not the part where we formulate language sometimes. So it could create challenges there. We can have issues with intimacy and develop parts or traces of codependency because of trauma. So that's, how it can affect us personally. And then professionally, it can alter our goals, right? Maybe unfulfilled career goals, because maybe we feel like we can't attain these things because of what we've experienced. It can cause individuals to abuse power because of trauma. They want to be in control and be hypervigilant, and they can abuse power because they never want to be in a position where someone hurts them again. It can cause blurred lines between work life and personal life. So people who have experienced trauma oftentimes have high levels of stress and anxiety. They are more likely to burn out because understanding that what you needed to survive your traumatic childhood or situation may not be what is helpful for you to thrive in your career. So sometimes trauma gets us stuck in patterns where if it worked then it has to work now, and it might not be working now. So oftentimes folks can become workaholics and they just immerse themselves so much into their work because they're afraid of being in similar situations that they were in before, or they're avoiding certain situations. And trauma can really cause us to self-sabotage. It can cause us to set ourselves up for failure. So looking at how this can impact us personally and professionally is really important. So I like to say this, y'all may not know, but I like to joke. And one thing I say is if you want to stir up all of your unresolved childhood trauma, become an entrepreneur, okay? Start a business or go to work, right? These situations tend to stir up some of those insecurities or those experiences we had. So I usually say, that's a telltale. If you're going through something in business or professionally, we always want to understand, what is this connected to? What does this feel familiar to? Because we know with EMDR, we say a lot of the past is the present, right? So a lot of things that impact us in the past show up in our present day to day, right? So these are some trauma wounds. I'm looking forward to sharing them with you, and we'll go through them. There's 6 trauma wounds that I created over the course of my career, just noticing. I work with children who've experienced, I work with adults and kids' bodies, I call them, but adults who have experienced childhood trauma, basically. And these are some of the areas and markers that I find that comes up a lot. So I want to go over them with you, and I want you to mark down which ones feel like, it may be multiple, maybe one in particular, but which ones feel like connect to your experience personally. So when we look at a wound is anything that hinders you from operating as your best self, and it could be anything that drives you to become your best self. So there's a polarity to the wounds that we experience, and how we fall on that spectrum is going to be up to us in terms of how much we do to get insight around these and to work on healing. So your wound can either hinder you, or it can be the catalyst that drives you, and you get to choose, how you fall on that spectrum or how that impacts your day to day. So this trauma wound, we're looking at that scarcity wound, right? So I like to believe, I like to try to keep an open and abundant, flexible growth mindset. And that says that there's enough people serving for everybody to eat, and there's enough people hungry for everyone to serve, right? So whatever capacity you work in, knowing that there is an abundance of people who are looking for you, who need you, and you hold a value in the space that you work in. So kind of keeping that in mind. But when you've experienced a wound where there was scarcity, it can cause you to have shadiness towards others, right? It could cause you to want to hoard and collect things because you've experienced lack and you don't want to ever experience that again. You can have a crab in the bucket mentality where you don't want to see somebody go up, so you pulling them down to keep them from going up, but that causes everybody to have to stay in the bucket. And there tends to be a perpetual sense of lack when we're looking at a scarcity wound. And this wound can cause you to get stuck in survival mode, right? So being mindful of that. The resources of a scarcity wound, or the benefit to some degree, I don't want to say it's beneficial to have this wound, but ways that you can operate in an adaptive way with this is generosity. So sometimes people who experience lack tend to be generous, right? Because you know what it's like to not have. So you can be more mindful, you can be more compassionate, you can have more insight around someone that may not be openly talking about what's going on with them, but you see markers and tracers that could indicate they need some additional support. And it can cause you to be to operate from a space of preparation, right? So because you know what it's like not to have, you are more mindful and you have more forethought of how to prepare, right? So those are some of the implications and negative aspects of a scarcity wound, and then some ways that that wound can be resourceful. The next one is the inferiority wound, right? So for this one of the quotes I like to use to tie this in is, one of the worst leaders you can ever experience is one that leads through their insecurity. And I'm going to tell you why. Because the purpose of their mission becomes more so about filling their own void than fueling the vision of the organization. So if you're dealing with an inferiority wound and you operate from a leadership position or a position of power, you have to be very mindful of, am I making these decisions, or am I moving in a way that's going to fulfill the void that I have, or am I moving in a way that's going to overall be beneficial for the collective? So for someone who has this wound, they constantly need validation. They tend to overcompensate. So they do more because there's an internal lack. They feel like they have to do more. They tend to procrastinate. They have a low expectation for themselves. So they're always trying to up the ante. And then they typically have that imposter syndrome. They don't feel like they belong. They feel like these spaces aren't designed for them, or they didn't earn or work for, or aren't deserving of the space that they're in. And there's a decreased sense of accomplishment. So it doesn't matter what they do, they walk away feeling like it wasn't enough, right? So that's kind of like what an inferiority wound creates. The resources is these folks tend to be cheerleaders, right? So you know what it feels like to not feel like you're enough, or that you're doing enough or capable. So if you see somebody working or trying, you may be able to push them along or encourage them. They tend to be very hardworking. They tend to prepare. There's that sense of acceptance and humility that they hold, and they could have a sense of contentment as well. So these can be some benefits to having that inferiority wound, or some ways that we can work in an adaptive way. So questions you can ask yourself to see where this originates is, who told you that you weren't good enough? Right? Where do you feel like that came from? Because oftentimes that belief is what's driving that belief, or that event is driving the wounds. So the next one we have is the abandonment wound. So this one is big, y'all, because abandonment can show up in various ways, shapes, and forms. But for this wound, there's a fear of loss. So then I tend to tolerate more things, or there is a lack of tolerance. So it's either I'm extremely tolerant, or there's no negotiation, right? I'm cutting you off left and right. These folks tend to avoid connection. They have difficulties asking for help. So they avoid connection, but they crave it at the same time. So it's a very challenging space to be in. And they have the expectation that people will fail them, yet they desire to be rescued, right? So some abandonment resources is they can long and strive for connection. Because of that wound, they definitely desire to connect. They can have a lot of consideration and thoughtfulness around what other people need, and that doesn't always have to be a bad thing. They can operate from a space of kindness and thoughtfulness. They may, because of their wound and their experience, have developed good boundaries. They may be very helpful and anticipate what other people need. And they could be interdependent. And what interdependence means is I can stand on my own, and I can accept support and support and help from other people. So the quote I like to tie into this one is, your reaction does not have to be your identity, and their response does not have to dictate your value. So with this abandonment wound, oftentimes it feels like my value is connected to how other people respond to me. And if they want to be around me, then that means I'm good and valuable. And if they decide to go, then that's a reason, then that means there's something wrong with me. And really understanding how to work through this wound, especially professionally, you may have clients that come and go. You may have jobs that come and go. And if you're attaching the outcome of that situation to your value, it can be really detrimental. So the next one is the rejection wound. And this one can create social anxiety for folks. They fear being out and about, but then they also want to be close. They may have wavering goals. And this is because they're basing what they do on if I will be accepted, right? So it can be very wishy-washy, and their goals may be inauthentic. So they may shift and change their goals based off of the climate of the room. So they operate more like a thermometer than a thermostat. So a thermostat is going to set the temperature for the room. A thermometer is going to change every time the temperature changes. And oftentimes folks who have a rejection wound bounce from task to task because they're looking for that outside approval and validation and don't have a good sense of self. Some resources for this is maybe they could be content alone. They may be very good team players. They may have more of a community-oriented mindset. This person can advocate and operate from a space of confidence. So one of the quotes I like to tie into this is, if you live for praise, you'll die by criticism. So the tricky part is, if you feel really good when people say you're awesome, then that's great. But what happens when they don't think you're awesome? Then you drop. So the work that I do with a lot of my folks is helping them to separate their worth, value, and identity to what they directly do, because you'll feel like you're on a roller coaster if it's directly linked and connected. The next one is the invisible wound. So this one is kind of tricky because it can feel like something's missing. I have some hypervigilance, some defensiveness, some guilt, some perfectionism. This invisible wound shows up. It's like a cancer, and it connects to everything, or, gets into kind of bleeds into every situation or everything you're connected to. And it can show up a lot in marginalized communities, because when we're dealing with microaggressions and things of that nature, maybe you don't necessarily see it, but it's interwoven into the system, and things aren't for me. And I have these wounds because of my race, my identity, my culture. And it can cause me to feel like I have to do more to be accepted, right? Some resources for this wound is situational awareness. These folks can be empathetic, protective, compassionate, operate from a space of excellence, and be very supportive. So when we're looking at this wound, it's important to understand that the wound the belief that your wound produced is always in the room, right? So when you have these invisible wounds, they're always with you, they're in the room, and they're bleeding into all of the work that you do, all of the spaces you enter. And this is the last wound, y'all, but this one is really important to look out for because it operates somewhat like that invisible wound sometimes. So the quote I tie into this is, when you normalize privilege, you minimize the struggle of those who lack because of the system that assigns your opportunities, okay? So we all have some sort of privilege. We have privileges because of our race. We have privileges because of our gender, because of our background, ethnicity, socioeconomic status, our ability, our sexual orientation. So there are different things that provide various privileges for you in different spaces, right? That can cause you to be more privileged or less privileged, right? So when we're looking at this wound, we need to understand that a person that operates from this space is easily offended. They have difficulty accepting boundaries because their privilege won't allow them to accept a no. They're used to being able to kind of move about and do, what their privilege offers them the ability to do. They typically have a skewed work ethics. They have intense fears of losing. They have a fear of retaliation. They need to be viewed as exceptional in all spaces and all of the time. And if they're not, it's activating. And they have an increased sense of shame and guilt. And that shame and guilt comes because there's a part of them that knows that their privilege allowed them the opportunity to have some of the resources that they have. And there's a constant fear of that being stripped away from them or taken from them. So we often look at trauma as if this is what I did not receive, or this is what happens to me. But when we understand that it's a spectrum, sometimes overcompensating in various areas can create a wound, right? Because you had too many opportunities. No one ever told you no. You were able to move about in spaces without resistance, or without a challenge, or with power and authority. So when we're looking at a privilege wound, the fear of that individual is that they might lose power. And the dangerous thing about this wound is oftentimes they will do extreme things to maintain that power. And that sometimes includes harming others. So this is something to be aware of. When you know your privileges, you can move in an effective way through them. And a resource to having privilege is being supportive and cognizant of others and the privileges that they don't have. Being a change agent, right? Being an advocate, being an ally, being resourceful and generous, and being able to utilize your social capital for the good of others, right? To promote equity. So understanding that trauma, all of these wounds, all of these things, they can dictate everything from your fees, your time, your energy, your relationships, how you handle stress. They have multiple ways that they can impact us. This quote says, physical wounds break your skin, emotional wounds break your heart, spiritual wounds break your spirit, and financial wounds break your mindset. So as we're looking into recognizing the signs of being stuck, these are some ways that we can be stuck and we can feel unmotivated. We can feel stuck and paralyzed. And some of the things that contribute to those stuck points is some blocking beliefs and that we have, like within our business, like maybe I'm incompetent, I'm a failure. All of these beliefs can be integrated into those various wounds, and they can really stifle us and keep us from being able to move forward if we're not aware of them. So this is something I love to use, and it's called a trauma cascade. And basically, it really looks at the nervous system and how we move through decisions in our business. So I like to call them the 5 Fs. We look at fight, flight, freeze, flop, and friend. And depending on what's showing up for you, it's going to depend on how you decide to handle various business decisions, right? We have that stress response, and this is how we move through, knowing that the goal for all of us is to be stabilized, to feel grounded, neutral, calm. And if something feels like it's going to compromise that, then oftentimes we're making decisions based off of an activated nervous system. And knowing that we make these decisions from an activated nervous system, it's important to know that what we witness oftentimes with trauma is a normal coping mechanism in response to an abnormal situation. So considering the circumstances that you're in, it makes sense that that's the way you will respond. Considering your circumstances, it makes sense. Considering your childhood, right? It makes sense. So it's not that you're abnormal. It's the circumstances that you were brought up in or that you're living in. That's what's abnormal. So as we look into healing, right? I'm big on self-care. My self-care workbook is packed with tools, right, to do this. Self-awareness is a start. So through this exercise, through this presentation, we talked about some wounds for you to be aware of, right? And that self-awareness oftentimes is a start to help you be able to manage stress and reduce anxiety and regulate your nervous system. Journaling is a great way. That breathing is a great way to be able to regulate your system so you can make wise, informed decisions in your business and practice and personal life. Writing in and of itself, like literally shifts you to a different part of your brain, which can be extremely helpful. So some therapeutic modalities, I'm always going to encourage you to go to therapy. It doesn't have to be catastrophic or life-threatening. If you saw yourself in any of these wounds, any of the different types of trauma, it may be beneficial for you to seek help and find a therapist. I like to work on bottom-up approaches that really get into how trauma is stored in our bodies. And EMDR is a great approach to do that. Like I said, I'm a trainer and consultant for for EMDR and trauma-informed somatic therapy or brain spotting is a great way to help you like move forward in those ways. And then we want to seek help, and it's not because you're broken or something's wrong with you. It's really to help you with getting support, right? All of us support others. And I think it would be hypocritical to think that I can be so supportive of others, but I can't accept support myself, right? So understanding that this helps relieve symptoms, it can help you make informed decisions. It can really help with compassion, fatigue, and burnout, being able to seek help from others. So one thing I always say as we're wrapping up is if you can find the source, you can find the solution. And therapy oftentimes helps you to find the source of your challenges. But a way that we need to do this is really by being resilient and offering yourself self-compassion. You know, we often lead with criticism, blaming yourself for negative things that happen, feeling like you're not competent, comparing yourself to others, and overanalyzing and negative self-talk. A thing that I do all the time is if I have a presentation, for instance, this one, I will not give myself any feedback, criticism, anything. I give myself 24 hours, right? So anytime you have something and if you have space, give yourself 24 hours just to regulate your system, get some time away from it, and then revisit it. Because sometimes checking in on things immediately after can be really, you can be very critical of yourself. So you want to be able to separate yourself from the negative. You want to be able to operate from a space of humility. And when I look at humility, I look at the fact that we're human, and you being able to lean into your humanity and being able to give yourself grace. And this is a platform, this is a approach that I designed and I use to really help to build your resilience and help you be able to offer yourself compassion. And that's the rewire approach. So we understand our roots, we tap into the emotions, we create wellness plans for ourselves, we promote in a healthy way to identify ourselves with positive belief statements. We recognize our resources, whether they be past, present, or future, and we're always open to evolving, knowing that we're constantly shifting and changing, and we're open to that evolution. So as we look at this, bringing our whole self into work, we want to be able to integrate this into your day-to-day. So developing a schedule where you look to operate from a space of humility, where you increase your creative energy, you bring that into the work that you do. And this will help you not be as activated, you know, when things happen. The more you regulate, the less you activate. So being able to incorporate some regulation skills. And then we always want to, knowing that that mask and that wound often wants us to armor up, right? And to present ourselves in a way that we feel like is acceptable. But I always like to say real recognizes real. So when you can be authentic and show up as your real self, it really opens up the connections that you can make with your loved ones, with your clients, being open to partnerships and collaborations, and understanding that peer groups are vital. So if you don't have a profession, I say everyone should have someone that knows a little bit more than them that they can go to for support, and somebody that's on their level that you can go to just to normalize some of the experiences that you're having. So developing peer groups within your workplace, developing consultation groups as well can be extremely helpful in helping you to move forward and move through that trauma. So we went over some of here's a recap, okay? I know it was quick, but I'm here, I'm not going anywhere. So if y'all want to connect with me, you always can. But we talked about some different types of trauma. We talked about those wounds and how they impact us. I want you to understand your wounds and how they're showing up. And then ways that you can journal, be mindful, meditate, practice self-care practices to help regulate your nervous system. And ultimately, we want to operate from a space of self-compassion over criticism. So I know that is our time. So I want to pause and check in with Carrie. I know that was a lot and I hope it was helpful, but I want to know what questions you have. This is a QR code that I created for y'all. Feel free to scan it, and we'll send a link out with for you to be able to access all of these resources I've compiled for y'all for this presentation. So what questions do we have, Carrie?
Well, I think everyone was just so attentive and listening to every rich detail you were sharing. Most of the things that came in Q&A were talking about how amazing you are. So we don't have a bunch of questions, but I would encourage the folks who are still with us to please ask some.
Yeah.
And in the meantime, I am happy to pick your brain because I was captivated. Obviously, I am not a therapist. I work in marketing, but I related to so much of what you covered today. Just in terms of like bringing my whole self to work. And I sort of felt like I fell into a number of those buckets that you went through. And I mean, I don't know about the rest of the folks on this call, but for me, I never know if I should talk about it at work, like with colleagues, or if I should keep it to myself because I'm a little bit old school. And I sort of grew up hearing, no, don't talk about that at work. Like, don't let people know what you're thinking or if you're upset. You keep that to yourself. And so I sort of struggle, and I'm wondering what your thought is on that. Like, is that something we should talk about? Should you talk about it with like a boss or a colleague, or just try to sort of go through those mindfulness techniques and cope with it on our own?
I think that's a great question. And I think that creates a challenge sometimes because it's like, ooh, is this going to impact me negatively if I
Yeah.
speak up about what I'm feeling? So I
Yeah.
think that's having spaces or creating spaces within the workplace, whether it be peer groups, where you have space to talk about those things. I think having a way that you can regulate individually, and then you'll be able to make more of a not a trauma-based decision in
Mm.
terms of who, where, how much to talk about, right? Because
Yeah.
oftentimes what we do is we are flighty sometimes, and we will like emotion trauma dump, right? Or
Yeah.
vomit things out. And then afterwards it's like, oh, what did I do? I said too much, right? So if we developed a practice of regulation first, I think that would really help us to gauge how much information we presented. But I think in terms of I'm having a rough day, or I'm a little activated, or give me I think those things are healthy and safe to delve into. And then if you're depending on the proximity or the closeness you have with the person
Mm.
determines how much, you know what I mean? Like
Yeah.
how much you care. So I think having a good regulation practice can help you make that decision, more of an informed decision.
Yeah, that's so smart.
Mhm.
I know it's hard to think through that when you're feeling emotional. And
Mhm.
I think it's probably good to just take a beat and not, address
Mhm.
in the moment, but like give yourself that moment to
Give
collect.
yourself a minute.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So good. Of course, I can't be greedy and hog all your time. So let me address some of the questions that came in.
Yeah,
Um,
what can
yeah, so an anonymous attendee asked, could you just quickly go over the first trauma wound again? And just for everyone on the call, you will be getting a link to the recording, and we'll also share the slides. So don't feel like
Mhm.
you're going to miss anything, but we'll have you, Netta, just quickly go over that first trauma wound again.
Yeah, so that first one we talked about was scarcity,
Mhm.
and that can happen if you experienced maybe like some kind of neglect in some way, low socioeconomic status, grew up in a culture that had generational scarcity. So even though I have everything that I want and need, there's still that fear that I'll lose it. So that mindset looks sometimes if it's operating in a negative space, there could be like some shadiness towards others, crabs in a bucket mentality, a sense of lack, and like I'm stuck in survival mode. I'm always scared that I don't know if the check is coming tomorrow or if I'm going to have what I need. And this happens with a lot of people who are super successful. Like financially, they're okay, but there's that sense that something could happen tomorrow and I could lose everything.
Yeah.
Mhm. And
Yeah.
that often comes from that scarcity wound.
Okay. Thank you for
Mhm.
that. And I just wanted to remind folks, you will see the slides too. So we had someone ask to go over Rewire again, but you'll have access to all that.
Yeah,
Um,
you'll get it. Mhm.
yes, sit tight on that one. Scarlett is asking if you had to pick one certification to get a general idea of trauma to help clients with anxiety and depression, for example, which would it be?
Mhm. So I'm going to say EMDR. And the reason why I'm going to say EMDR is not just because I'm a trainer, but for me as a clinician, it really helped me conceptualize and shape and be able to really look at how trauma develops, understand the nervous system, understand the body, and understand how to formulate the path towards healing with folks. So I would always recommend EMDR. This is a QR code for my mailing list if you want to learn more about EMDR and stay connected with me. And then this is another one, and I can go back to any of these if I need to. These are some QR codes for trainings, and there's a program we worked with a team and got a great grant for that's getting over 300 folks trained in Pennsylvania for free. So if you want to look at that, that's an offering for EMDR training if you know anybody in the state of Pennsylvania. But yeah, I would definitely recommend EMDR.
Awesome. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Nicole is asking, how can we work through intergenerational trauma in session when it comes up for therapy seekers?
Yes. So a lot of intergenerational trauma is really understanding the origin of it and how it's landing in that person's system, how it's showing up in their environment presently, and really getting into the body. So when we're looking at intergenerational trauma, because it's passed through our DNA, it's oftentimes like trapped in our bodies.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So a lot of somatic work, a lot of identifying what's going on in the body and helping people to process that can really help with intergenerational trauma. I like Mario Bouquet has a book called Break the Cycle, and it has amazing like resources for how to move through assessments for intergenerational trauma, as well as healing techniques and ways to move through it. So I would highly recommend that.
Excellent. Thank you. Erica is asking if you have any tips on the invisible wounds and how they may be triggered with the political climate right now. I have a few clients who have this trauma wound and they're triggered due to politics right now.
Absolutely. Oof. Politics this season has anxiety on an all-time high, right? Mm-hmm. So what I like to do is be able to name and normalize what's happening in this climate, and then being able to shift from internal to external focus. So politics brings up a lot of anxiety because there are unknowns of what's going to happen, who's going to win, what is this going to change, and they're very valid unknowns. It's being able to recognize that those are valid and being able to shift internally to say, what is my part? Mm-hmm. What can I do? How can I inform myself? How can I educate myself? How can I make informed decisions? So really being able to shift from that internal to external is super important around this time, and doing things to regulate your nervous system, monitor social media intake, news intake. You really have to be able to put boundaries around what's going on because so much information is flooding in and it's overwhelming.
Yeah, good advice. Mm-hmm. For sure. I think we're all feeling it.
Yeah.
Let's see. Jen is asking, how would you describe the key differences between EMDR and brain spotting? And for what mm-hmm. primary presenting factors or populations are they best utilized for?
Yeah, so EMDR, the founder of brain spotting actually was an EMDR therapist that discovered brain spotting while doing EMDR. So that's pretty cool. Brain spotting is more of both of them work very well. EMDR is more structured to some degree. Brain spotting is more open, a lot of free association. So the way that I work, I utilize both. I usually start with the setup, structure, psychoeducation, preparation of EMDR, and then I choose in which way that I will integrate the processing part. Both of them are very beneficial and helpful for folks. I tend to gravitate to setting up a foundation with EMDR and then learning brain spotting. That's my personal opinion, just because of the structure and the education that you learn about how the system works with EMDR. So it really depends on the person. So being able to meet that client in front of you and identifying what approach is going to be best. It's not one is best than the other. We cater based off of what the person in front of us needs.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. Mm-hmm. Perfect. Stephen is saying excellent presentation, which it is. Do you have a book that folks can get? Did you?
Mhm.
I think you did.
So
Third, yeah.
yeah. So I have a self-care workbook. It's a great place to get started. This is what it looks like. It's on Amazon, and on that landing page link I had, you can look at, that has the links for it, downloads. But this is what it looks like, and it's a workbook. It's light, but it really helps you to get in depth with how you develop your self-care practices, ways to take better care of yourself. So that's on this QR code. And I think, if you signed up for the list, my mailing list, I'll make sure that you get all of the resources, that we have here today. This is for me. So if y'all want to do this, I know it's a lot of QR codes. I like QR codes. So this is for me to just send feedback. Let me know how this was for you. Super helpful as I'm developing new trainings and helping clinicians and healthcare workers. It's really good for me to have your feedback. And you can follow me on all of these social platforms as well. I might hop on live after this if y'all want to chat some more. So
Love it. Love it. Thank you. Let's see how we are. Okay, we have a couple minutes. I'm going to tackle
okay.
more of these questions. So Courtney is saying that she has a client who has a significant history of trauma from the foster system. She's also struggling with substance abuse. How do you start with clients that have so much going on, and like, where do you start with the work?
Yeah. So EMDR is a great way to conceptualize that. I like to start with the nervous system, right? It's driving everything. So I love to start with, I always say regulation before information. So you got to really help that client find a way to ground, relax, be neutralized. Because when we look at substances and folks who are abusing substances, that I always say the goal is for all of us is stabilization. We just want to feel calm, neutral, grounded. Whatever's going to provide that is what we're going to utilize. So if the substance provided stabilization, then that's a hardwired, neural network space where they're going to go to it. But if we can find ways to provide stabilization for them in other ways, then it helps them to not feel like the substance is the only way. So I would really start with some somatic and regulation and breathing and just helping them to ground themselves. I think that could be very helpful.
Okay, amazing. I have to just call out Patrick Cassal's comment because I love Patrick, and he is your workbook is amazing, and that he's hired you to train his group practice staff and gave you a 10 out of 10. So right there, we got validation from somebody on the call. I love it. I love it.
Thank you, Patrick.
Yeah, he's a sweetie. Lots of good feedback here. I know we're right on noon, so we probably need to wrap, but I would encourage anyone who wants to continue the dialogue with Yunetta to please reach out, because she has been so transparent and lovely today and giving us myriad ways to reach her. I want to personally thank you so much for joining. This has been incredible. I know I have some work to do now, but this has just been so good. So thank you. Any final words for us?
Yes. I just want to thank you, Carrie. Thank you, Spruce, for this opportunity to share with your community. I don't take it lightly. And I would say for everyone, just one thing. It's a lot, we're not going to heal years of work in a day, right? But if you can take 5 minutes every day to give yourself to breathe, to regulate, to operate in a space where you're pouring into yourself, it can make a world of a difference. So that's what I would encourage you. Pick one thing and lean into it, and you'll see the shift.
Love it. I love it. I'm going to lean into it. Thank you. And I hope everybody has a terrific rest of your day, and look for the email with a link to the recording and to the slides, and connect with Yunetta. And let's just all keep putting our best foot forward.
Yep. Sounds good. Y'all take care.
Take care.